The forum boreum smelled of damp stone and cattle dung. Beneath its open sky, 3 pairs of armored men stepped into a makeshift arena. They were not soldiers. They were slaves trained to fight not for their own glory, but as an offering to the dead. The year was 264 BC. Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva had just buried his father, and to mark the occasion, he staged what Roman historian Livy would later record as the first gladiatorial combat in Rome. At first, this was no public spectacle. It was a funeral rite, what the Romans called a munus, a duty owed to the deceased. The combatants bled not for cheers, but as a solemn gift. The Romans believed the spilling of blood appeased the restless spirits of the dead, an echo of older, darker customs. In Campania, tombs had once been honoured by human sacrifice. In Samnite lands, duels were fought beside graves to honour ancestors. In these traditions, the sword was as sacred as incense, the wound as sacred as prayer, yet rituals evolve. In southern Italy, especially in Capua, death in these duels had already begun to lose its religious edge. The clash itself, the courage, the spectacle, the possibility of survival drew more fascination than the sacrifice. Over time, ritual killing became ritual combat. The death itself mattered less than the struggle. Centuries later, the Christian writer Tertullian would describe it bluntly, the spilling of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead. But by then, the dead were no longer the only audience. The living had taken over. By the late 3rd century BC, the duels were moving from funerals to festivals. The ludi, Rome's great public games, were expanding, and gladiatorial combat slid into their program. At first, the ludi were religious, held to honor Jupiter during moments of crisis, when the Senate feared divine wrath. But once blood was spilled in the forum, the appetite grew. Magistrates discovered that these spectacles, once private, could win them votes, loyalty, and favor. Blood became politics, death became display. The state absorbed what had begun as an intimate rite of mourning. Wooden arenas were built to contain the crowds. By the last century of the Republic, they would be replaced by stone amphitheatres, permanent monuments to a culture where power was written in sand, sweat, and blood. But Rome was not content with man against man. The next innovation was more primal, man against beast. The iron gates groaned open, and silence spread like a tide across the amphitheatre. From the shadows, a lone figure stepped barefoot into the glare of sunlight, clutching a short blade. Across the sand, another gate rose, and with it came the guttural snarl of a starving lion. Its ribs jutted beneath matted fur, its eyes wide with hunger. What followed was not a duel, but an execution, an ordeal staged as entertainment. By the 1st century CE, arenas had become theatres of confrontation between man and animal. Romans gave these shows names: venationes when staged as hunts, damnatio ad bestias when used as punishment. The condemned were criminals, prisoners of war, rebels, human lives thrown to sharpen claws and stir the crowd. Hunger itself was a weapon. The beasts were starved so that desperation would drive them toward the man in the sand. The origins of these spectacles reached back to the late Republic, when generals discovered that animals could serve propaganda as well as weapons. Pompey, ever eager to outshine rivals, staged grand hunts with panthers, leopards, and lions imported from Africa. For him, each animal slain was more than a death. It was a symbol of Rome's domination of distant lands. Exotic beasts testified to the empire's reach, their deaths a ritualized reminder that even nature was Rome's subject. But not all who faced beasts were condemned criminals. Some were professionals, men called bestiarii, trained to fight against animals with spears, nets, or nothing but courage. The crowds admired them as they admired gladiators, though, with an edge of horror. Stone reliefs captured the desperate choreography. A man with his spear poised as a lion leapt, a netcaster dodging a panther's strike, a fighter meeting a beast's gaze, a heartbeat before death. These depictions were no fantasy. In Roman Britain, archaeologists uncovered the pelvis of a man scarred by the bite of a great feline, likely a lion. His wounds, fossilized in bone, told a story no scribe recorded. He had met his end in the sand, torn apart for spectacle. Even so, some refused to play their role. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, noted how certain prisoners would take their own lives before their scheduled appearance. Better to die by one's own hand than to be devoured for applause. It was a silent rebellion, the only defiance left to those stripped of choice. What unfolded in the arena was never just violence, it was calculation. The hunger of the beasts, the terror of the condemned, the suspense of the crowd, all were orchestrated to bind entertainment to power. The roar of the lion was not simply nature unleashed, it was the voice of the state, sharpened by starvation, echoing Rome's ability to decide who lived and who died. With every scream, with every drop of blood, the Romans reminded themselves, and the world. Here was an empire that mastered not just men, but beasts, rituals, and death itself. The water shimmered under the Roman sun, still and glassy, waiting. Then the sound of drums broke the silence. Horns blared, oars struck the surface, and two fleets surged toward one another across a man-made lake. Soldiers stood on triremes armed with spears and catapults. On the banks, thousands roared from stone bleachers. It looked like war, but it was theatre. The Romans called them Naumachiae, naval battles staged not in distant seas, but in carefully engineered basins dug by imperial command. Julius Caesar was the first to attempt it in 46 BC. Near the Tiber, he ordered an artificial lake carved into the earth to stage a reenactment of a war between Tyrians and Egyptians. The ships were real, the weapons were real, and the men condemned prisoners were very real, fighting without the hope of survival. Their blood turned water to crimson. His heir, Augustus, pushed the boundaries further. In 2 BC, he commissioned an immense basin measuring nearly 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet, so vast it demanded its own aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, to fill it. On those waters, 30 warships clashed, each packed with men who had been stripped of freedom and armed only for the benefit of a watching crowd. Tens of thousands witnessed the carnage. The scale alone was staggering, but the message was sharper. Rome commanded not only armies, but rivers and seas. Nature itself bent to imperial will. The obsession with spectacle grew. In AD 52, Emperor Claudius drained Lake Fucine, a massive mountain lake, and turned it into a stage for war. Thousands of fighters rode across its expanse. When Claudius arrived, they greeted him with words that history preserved in chill simplicity. Morituri te salutant. Those who are about to die salute you. Whether rehearsed or spontaneous, the phrase carried the fatal resignation of men sentenced to perish in the name of entertainment. Even the Colosseum, opened under Titus in AD 80, may have seen its arena flooded for miniature sea battles. Domitian, his successor, likely repeated the feat. Later still, Trajan constructed the Naumachiae Vaticana in AD 109, a vast flooded arena near the Vatican Hill where more orchestrated wars played out. The more ships sank, the louder the cheers rose. Each Naumachiae was more than performance. It was propaganda carved into spectacle, a display that Rome could bend earth, stone, and water into theatres of death. These were not mere games. They were declarations of dominion. If Rome could recreate seas at its whim, then what could not Rome command? But spectacle did not stop at fleets and beasts. Rome pushed deeper into myth itself. By the time the Colosseum opened, executions had become theatrical reenactments of legend. The poet Martial, who witnessed the inaugural games under Titus, described scenes where myth and reality bled together. In one performance, an Orpheus figure stepped into the arena, lyre in hand, to charm wild animals with his song. In the myth, nature bends to his music. In Rome, the bear tore him apart, on cue. Another condemned man played Daedalus, the great inventor who fashioned wings of wax. Instead of flying, he was cast into the arena where beasts ripped him to pieces. Martial, with dry cruelty, remarked, "How you must wish you had your feathers now." The myth of Pasiphae, cursed with lust for a bull, was also twisted into a grotesque display. A woman, or perhaps a disguised prisoner, was thrown before a beast, her agony staged as entertainment. Myth became not allegory, but punishment disguised as theatre. Fire joined the arsenal. The condemned were wrapped in the tunica molesta, a garment soaked in pitch and oil before being set ablaze. Sometimes the execution was framed as the death of heroes such as Mucius Scaevola, who legendarily proved his loyalty by holding his hand in fire. Whether named as Scaevola or another martyr, the reality was the same, screams rising above flames while the audience clapped. For Christians, these spectacles carried bitter resonance. Tertullian wrote, "With fury of victims turned into kindling men, human torches mocked as actors in dramas of pain. In such plays, death was not punishment, nor even theatre, it was domination." Rome staged suffering to remind the living that resistance was futile and that even myth bowed to imperial cruelty. The arena blurred boundaries. Theatre became execution, myth became murder, and in that blur lay Rome's genius for control. By transforming stories into stages of blood, emperors wove their authority into the fabric of legend. Audiences were not just entertained, they were instructed, trained to see power as absolute, natural, inevitable. As flames burned, as lions roared, as ships sank in lakes dug by command, Rome demonstrated not only its capacity for violence, but its mastery of meaning. Death itself became imperial language. And yet, the legacy of these spectacles is not just marble ruins and dusty texts. It lingers in our unease, our debates about violence, about entertainment, about the hunger to watch others struggle. Rome turned ritual into policy, politics into performance, and blood into a stage. Seneca, who sat in those stands centuries ago, left behind a confession. "I come home," he wrote to his friend Lucilius. "More greedy, more ambitious, more self-indulgent, yes, even more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings." His words echo across time, a warning etched in ink. The theatre of death does not end with the dying, it lives on in those who watch.